All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we are diving deep into the Modern Day Podcast's Jeffrey Epstein series.
Ooh, yeah.
And you guys, the audience, you specifically requested a deep dive into this one. And let me tell you, it gets wild.
It does. It really does.
So this is a rabbit hole that goes way deeper than your average true crime story.
Yeah.
We're talking power, we're talking abuse, we're talking about a network of connections that'll leave you scratching your head and wondering just how much goes on behind the curtain that we never see.
It's fascinating. It is how this series uses Epstein as a sort of lens to examine how power can really shield wrongdoing.
Yeah.
And it's not just about Epstein himself.
Right.
It's about the systems that allowed him to operate for so long.
Exactly. And that's what the podcast host really emphasizes right from the start. He talks about how difficult it is for journalists to even investigate these kinds of cases, especially when they involve powerful individuals with ties to intelligence agencies.
Right?
He even brings up the Denny Hastert case.
Yeah.
You know, a former Speaker of the House convicted of child molestation.
Right.
You would think that would be a huge story.
Yeah.
But it seemed to just vanish from public memory.
Yeah, it's like, it never happened.
So quickly. It's really weird.
What's interesting is that he uses this example to illustrate a bigger point.
Okay.
Which is that we often rely on this smoking gun evidence to prove these kinds of crimes.
Yeah.
But when you're dealing with intelligence agencies, secrecy's their bread and butter.
Right.
So how do you uncover the truth when the very nature of the system is designed to keep things hidden?
That's where this whole idea of circumstantial evidence comes in.
Right.
And this podcast is full of it. There's no direct proof, but there's a whole bunch of coincidences that seem way too suspicious to just ignore.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I mean, at what point does a coincidence become a pattern?
That's the question.
You know?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And it's one that requires a nuanced understanding of how these systems operate.
Okay.
One isolated incident might be easy to dismiss.
Yeah.
But when you see the same patterns repeating across multiple cases, it starts to paint a very different picture.
Absolutely. And the first case that the podcast dives into really highlights this.
Okay.
It's the King Cora Boys' home in Northern Ireland.
All right.
And it's just a horrifying story about systemic abuse within this home. And you have this British intelligence officer, Colin Wallace, who tried to expose it.
Right.
But instead of being lauded as a hero, he was met with resistance at every turn.
Think about that for a second. This is an intelligence officer, someone who is trained to identify threats.
Right.
And he's uncovering what appears to be a massive scandal involving the abuse of vulnerable children.
Right.
Yet his superiors not only fail to act, but they actively try to silence him. He was ultimately dismissed from the army on trumped-up charges.
Wow.
Essentially punished for doing his job.
It's like,
Wow.
it's crazy.
It's a classic example of what can happen when whistleblowers try to take on powerful interests.
Yeah.
But what makes it even more unsettling is the alleged involvement of high-ranking officials.
Right.
And the potential use of this abuse for blackmail.
Yeah.
I mean, that takes it to a whole other level.
It does.
And this is where understanding the mechanics of blackmail is crucial.
Okay.
It's not just about having compromising information on someone.
Right.
It's about the ability to leverage that information effectively.
Yeah.
In this case, if these allegations are true, we're talking about a network that was potentially using the abuse of children to control and manipulate individuals in positions of power.
It's terrifying. It really is.
It is.
And it's a pattern that seems to repeat itself throughout the series.
Yeah.
We see it again in the Dutroux affair in Belgium. A convicted child rapist, Marc Dutroux, is found to be holding young girls captive in a hidden dungeon.
Right.
But his claims of being part of the larger trafficking ring were ignored.
Right.
And the case was riddled with suspicious deaths and blatant obstruction of justice.
The sheer scale of the cover-up in the Dutroux affair is mind-boggling.
It is.
Witnesses died under mysterious circumstances.
Right.
Evidence went missing. And even the investigating judge who was trying to uncover the truth was removed from the case.
Wow.
This wasn't just a few bad apples.
Right.
This points to a system that was actively protecting something or someone at all costs.
It makes you wonder if these people, if these people in power are more interconnected than we realize. And that brings us to Jeffrey Epstein.
Right.
He was a wealthy financier.
Yeah.
But the source of his fortune has always been a bit of a mystery.
Right.
And the podcast host, he digs into some pretty interesting details about his early life that might shed some light on how he gained access
for these elite circles.
What stood out to you about Epstein's background?
Well, one thing that jumped out at me was his first job. He was completely unqualified to teach at the prestigious Dalton School.
Right.
Yet he landed the position thanks to a connection. The father of Bill Barr.
Oh, wow.
Who would later become Attorney General and oversee Epstein's arrest.
Right.
And ultimately, his death in prison.
That's a fascinating detail that many people overlook.
It's crazy.
And it gets even weirder when you consider that Bill Barr's father wrote a novel about, guess what?
What?
Elite, underage sex slavery.
So you can't make this stuff up.
You can't.
It's like we're peeking behind the curtain of this exclusive world where these types of crimes are not only committed, but seemingly accepted, or at least ignored by those at the top.
It raises some uncomfortable questions about the nature of power.
Yeah.
And the circles that Epstein operated in.
Right.
Was this a case of someone simply knowing the right people?
Or is there something more sinister at play?
Right, and that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
Epstein seemed to move effortlessly among the world's elite, including Bill Clinton, who flew on Epstein's private plane, nicknamed the Lolita Express, a staggering 26 times.
Wow.
There are even photos of Clinton with one of Epstein's victims.
The fact that a former president would maintain a close relationship with a convicted sex offender is at the very least a massive lapse in judgment.
Yeah.
But it also speaks volumes about the social circles that Epstein cultivated, where such behavior was seemingly tolerated, or perhaps even expected.
And speaking of baffling relationships,
we
can't forget about Les Wexner, the billionaire behind Victoria's Secret. This is where things get really strange. Wexner gave Epstein control over his finances and assets through power of attorney.
Wow.
He gifted him extravagant properties. And all for reasons that remain a complete mystery.
The depth of Wexner's trust in Epstein.
It's crazy.
A man with a shady past.
Yeah.
Is something I still can't wrap my head around.
Doesn't make any sense.
Was it simply a case of misplaced trust in a supposed financial genius?
Right.
Or was there something else going on that we're not privy to?
It's almost like Epstein had some kind of leverage over Wexner.
Right.
And that leads us to one of the most intriguing theories explored in this podcast. That Epstein was involved in blackmail, potentially gathering compromising information on powerful people for an intelligence agency.
Interesting.
The podcast host brings up Epstein's close ties to Ehud Barak, former Israeli prime minister. And more importantly, the head of Israeli military intelligence during the 1980s.
That's a key connection. Remember, Barak was involved in some incredibly sensitive operations, including the recruitment of Jonathan Pollard, a U.S. Navy intelligence analyst.
Who was convicted of spying for Israel.
So we're talking about espionage at the highest levels.
Absolutely.
And if Epstein was indeed involved in this world, it would certainly explain how he managed to amass such wealth and influence while seemingly operating above the law.
It's a theory. But a compelling one given the evidence presented in the podcast.
It is.
And it raises the question, how far did this alleged blackmail operation extend? Who else might have been caught in Epstein's web?
That's a chilling thought.
It is.
And it gets even more unsettling when you consider the mysterious circumstances surrounding Robert Maxwell, the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's longtime companion and alleged accomplice.
Maxwell's story is like something out of a spy novel.
It is.
Alleged arms dealing, smuggling, and potential work as a double or even triple agent.
It's crazy.
It all adds another layer of intrigue to this already complex story. And then there's the fact that he died under mysterious circumstances in 1991. Officially ruled an accidental drowning. But many believe there was more to it.
It's a pattern that emerges again and again in this series. People connected to Epstein dying in ways that raise more questions than answers.
Exactly.
It creates an atmosphere of suspicion.
It does.
It makes you wonder just how much we don't know.
Exactly. And the podcast host doesn't shy away from exploring those unanswered questions. He delves into some pretty controversial territory. including the Pizzagate conspiracy theory.
Ah, Pizzagate.
Yeah.
A prime example of how easily misinformation can spread, especially online.
Right.
It's important to note that this theory has been widely debunked, but it's still worth examining.
Okay.
Because it reveals a lot about how people interpret information.
Right.
Particularly when it comes to powerful individuals and potential abuses of power.
The podcast host approaches it from an interesting angle.
Okay.
He doesn't necessarily endorse the theory. Right. But he uses it as a case study in how distrust of authority and the mainstream media can contribute to the spread of these kinds of beliefs.
It's a nuanced approach that avoids dismissing people's concerns outright.
Yeah.
It recognizes that this distrust often stems from legitimate anxieties about the behavior of those in power.
Right.
And when you combine that distrust with a lack of transparency and a healthy dose of confirmation bias, it's easy to see how these theories take root and gain traction.
So before we dive into the specifics of Pizzagate and how it connects to the larger themes we've been discussing, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned so far.
What stands out to you?
For me, it's the recurring theme of powerful individuals seemingly operating above the law.
Right.
Whether it's Epstein, Hastert, or the individuals involved in the King, Cora, and Dutroux cases. We see a pattern of impunity and a willingness to go to great lengths to protect those at the top.
That's an astute observation. And it's something that the Pizzagate theory, despite its flaws, tacks into. It plays on this fear that there's a hidden world operating just beneath the surface, where powerful people engage in depraved acts with no accountability.
And whether or not that's true in this specific case, it's a fear that's not entirely unfounded.
No.
I mean, we've seen enough real-life examples of corruption and abuse of power to know that it's not just a figment of our imagination.
Absolutely. And it's something we need to be mindful of as we delve into the specifics of Pizzagate.
Okay.
Because while the theory itself might be baseless, it highlights a very real concern that potential for those in power to exploit their positions and the systems that often protect them. So let's unpack this Pizzagate theory.
Okay.
Where do you think the podcast host is going with this?
Well, he starts by talking about the 2016 release of the Podesta emails by WikiLeaks. Remember those?
Oh, yeah.
A lot of people saw those as proof of some kind of nefarious plot. Even though most of the emails were pretty mundane stuff.
It's fascinating how certain details, often taken out of context, can become fuel for these kinds of theories. The podcast host specifically highlights an email that mentions a handkerchief with a pizza-related map on it.
And he presents this as potential evidence of some kind of coded language, suggesting that pizza might be a euphemism for something more sinister. But isn't that a bit of a stretch?
It's possible.
I mean, couldn't it just be a quirky handkerchief?
It's possible, but remember, we're talking about people who are already primed to see a conspiracy. So when they come across a detail like this, it just confirms their suspicions, even if there's no real evidence to support it.
It's like they're looking for patterns.
Even
where none exist.
Exactly.
And then the podcast host brings up this spirit cooking event. Involving performance artist Marina Abramovich.
Yes.
It sounds pretty out there, you know, like writing with pig's blood, simulated cannibalism. And the fact that the Podesta brothers were invited to one of these events just added fuel to the fire. It's like, come on.
Abramovich's work is definitely provocative. And I can see how some people might find it disturbing. But to jump from there to accusations of satanic rituals and child abuse is a huge leap.
It's crazy.
It's like they're taking these isolated details and weaving them into a narrative that fits their preconceived notions.
It's almost like they're creating their own reality.
And
that's where things really spiraled out of control online. The podcast host talks about how people started connecting all these dots. Flimsy evidence, misinterpretations, outright fabrications, to create this elaborate theory about a child sex trafficking ring operating out of Comet Ping Pong.
A pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C. And the poor owner of that restaurant, James Alefantis, became the target of all sorts of harassment and threats.
It's crazy.
All because of his association with the Podestas. And his presence in some of those emails.
It's a perfect example of how these online theories can have real-world consequences.
Absolutely.
People started analyzing his social media posts. the restaurant's decor,
Right.
even the bands that played there.
Uh-huh.
And they found some things that, out of context, seemed to support their suspicions.
Like what?
Well, for example, Alefantis had a picture of a Roman statue on his Instagram.
Okay.
That depicted Antaeus,
Yeah.
the young lover of Emperor Hadrian.
Right.
And Comet Ping Pong hosted a band called Heavy Breathing, whose lead singer sometimes made jokes about pedophilia.
It's classic confirmation bias.
Yeah.
They were so focused on finding evidence to support their beliefs that they ignored anything that contradicted it. And the fact that some of these details were admittedly a bit odd just made it easier for them to fit them into their narrative.
And the podcast host doesn't shy away from acknowledging that some of this stuff is strange. But he also emphasizes that it's important to separate fact from fiction.
Right.
Just because something is unusual or disturbing doesn't automatically make it evidence of a crime.
He makes a crucial point about the danger of jumping to conclusions based on speculation and circumstantial evidence, especially when those conclusions can lead to real-world harm, as we saw in the case of Alefantis and Comet Ping Pong.
A man even showed up at the restaurant with a gun, convinced that he was going to uncover a child sex trafficking ring. It's a reminder that words have power. And the spread of misinformation can have very serious consequences.
So what's the takeaway from all of this? How does the Pizzagate theory tie back to the larger Epstein saga?
I think the podcast host is trying to illustrate how these conspiracy theories, while often based on flimsy evidence, can sometimes reveal a deeper truth about our anxieties and distrust of those in power.
That's an interesting point. It's like Pizzagate, for all its flaws, is a symptom of a larger societal issue. A growing sense that those at the top are not only capable of great evil, but are also likely to get away with it.
And when you look at the Epstein case, it's hard to argue with that sentiment. I mean, here's a man who was convicted of sex crimes, yet he continued to move in elite circles, seemingly untouchable.
And even after his death, there's still a sense that we haven't gotten the full story.
Like who else was involved?
Who else was involved?
What did they know?
What did they know?
And why did it take so long for him to face any real consequences?
And the podcast host doesn't let us forget that. He keeps circling back to this idea that the Epstein saga is about more than just one man. It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to flourish.
He uses the phrase network of impunity, which I think is a perfect way to describe it.
I agree.
It's this interconnected web of powerful individuals who protect each other, often at the expense of justice.
And that network extends beyond Epstein himself.
It does.
We see it in the Hester case, the King Cora case, the Dutroux affair. It's a pattern that repeats itself across time and geography, suggesting that this is not an isolated problem.
It's a systemic issue.
It is.
And it raises the question, how do you hold a network accountable?
That's a tough one.
It is. And the podcast host doesn't offer any easy answers. But he does suggest that part of the solution lies in demanding more transparency, asking tough questions, and refusing to accept the narratives we're often given by those in power.
He also emphasizes the importance of critical thinking. We need to be careful about the information we consume, especially online. And we need to be willing to challenge our own biases, even when it's uncomfortable.
So what are we left with after this deep dive into the Epstein saga and this detour into the world of Pizzagate? It's a lot to process.
It certainly is. But I think one of the most important takeaways is that we can't afford to be complacent. We need to be vigilant, aware of the potential for abuse, and willing to hold those in power accountable. Even when it seems impossible.
Because power, as we've seen, can be a dangerous thing.
It can.
Especially when it's concentrated in the hands of a few. And shielded from scrutiny.
And the Epstein saga, along with all of its disturbing tangents, is a potent reminder of that.
So where do we go from here? The podcast host ends by exploring the story of Robert Maxwell. In more detail. And it's just as mind-boggling as the rest of this series.
What struck you about Maxwell's story and how it relates to Epstein?
It's amazing how this series just keeps getting deeper and deeper.
It does. It really does.
It's like We're peeling back the layers of an onion, and with each layer, the story just gets more complex and the implications more unsettling.
The Maxwell connection is crucial here.
Right.
It really does. It provides a lot of context
Okay.
for understanding Epstein's potential motives.
Yeah.
And the methods that he may have employed.
Right, the podcast host.
Yeah.
He presents this theory that Epstein might have modeled his operation after Maxwell's, using similar tactics to gain power and influence.
The fascinating proposition.
Yeah.
We know that Maxwell allegedly had ties to intelligence agencies.
Right.
And was involved in all sorts of shady dealings.
Right.
If Epstein learned from him, it would explain a lot about his rise to prominence.
Yeah.
And his ability to operate with such impunity.
It's almost like Epstein saw Maxwell as a blueprint.
Right.
For how to navigate this world of power and secrecy. And the podcast host backs this up with some pretty compelling evidence.
What were some of the key details that stood out to you?
Well, he talks about how Epstein seemed to target individuals who were vulnerable in some way.
Right.
People with secrets. People who were desperate for money or influence.
Right.
And he would use those vulnerabilities to his advantage, either by offering them something they couldn't refuse or by threatening to expose their secrets.
It's a classic manipulation tactic.
Yeah.
Identify the weakness, exploit it, and then use that leverage to control the individual.
Right.
And if Epstein was indeed working with an intelligence agency, that leverage would have been even more potent.
Absolutely. Imagine the power you would wield. If you had compromising information on some of the world's most influential people, you could essentially dictate their actions, influence their decisions, maybe even control entire governments.
It's a chilling thought.
It is.
And it raises some uncomfortable questions about the nature of power and the lengths to which some will go to maintain it.
The podcast host doesn't shy away from those questions. He explores the ethical implications of these actions, the damage they inflict on individuals and society as a whole, and the urgent need for greater transparency and accountability.
He also challenges us to think critically about the information we're presented with, to question the narratives that are often crafted by those in power, and to seek out the truth even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient.
And that's a message that really resonates deeply.
It does.
Especially in today's world where we're constantly bombarded with information from all sides. It's easy to get lost in the noise, to accept what we're told without question. But this series reminds us that it's more important than ever to be discerning, to think for ourselves, and to demand answers from those who hold positions of authority.
It's a call to action for all of us.
It is.
To be more engaged, more informed, and more willing to hold those in power accountable for their actions.
And that's a powerful note to end on.
It is.
The Jeffrey Epstein saga is a complex and disturbing story. But it's one that we need to learn from.
Absolutely.
It's a reminder that power can be a dangerous thing. Especially when it's unchecked and operating in the shadows.
It highlights the importance of transparency, accountability, and the courage to speak truth to power, no matter how difficult or dangerous it may seem.
Because ultimately, it's up to all of us to ensure that justice prevails and that those who abuse their power are held accountable for their actions.
And by engaging in these conversations, by examining the evidence, and by challenging the narratives we're given, we can move closer to that goal.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Jeffrey Epstein series from the Martyr Made podcast.
It's been a journey.
It has been a journey, to say the least.
It has.
And while we may never have all the answers, I think we've gained a deeper understanding of the complex web of power, influence, and abuse that this story represents.
It's a story that will continue to unfold as more information comes to light. But for now, I think we've done a pretty thorough job of unpacking the key themes, the most compelling evidence, and the most important questions that this series raises.
And I hope this deep dive has inspired you to keep asking those questions, to keep digging for the truth, and to never stop demanding accountability from those who hold positions of power.
Absolutely.
Because the fight for justice is an ongoing one.
It is.
And it's a fight that we must all be a part of.
I agree.